Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our salon about a new book that has just been released today. So very, very exciting, and congratulations to our authors who are with us today. The book is Utopia for Our Century, a Manifesto of Hope, which is just like what an uplifting title. Yeah, I was very excited to pick it up and read it. I know the registered attendees, with the exception of Amy, I will get this to you after the after the salon, but you signed up so late that I didn't get a chance to send it over yet, but everybody else should have received the excerpt from the introduction, so you've sort of gotten a little taste of what the book is going to look like. Um, and but yeah, it was I really, really enjoyed reading it, and I'm excited to discuss it. With us today are our two authors of that book, David Albertson, who is a professor of religion and philosophy at the University of Southern California, and Jason Blakely, who is a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, which I believe that's a new position that you're just coming into, correct?
That's right. So thank you for using the new one. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
That's it's I'm sure always exciting, and maybe almost a relevant experience to the book to kind of be moving into a new space full of like new opportunities and new possibilities. Wonderful. Okay. Um, I am Taylor Zapolsky. I'm one of the co-hosts. My background is kind of on the science side of things. I did my PhD in biomedical science, and have spent a time at the Santa Fe Institute studying complex systems. And so I'm, very interested in these questions of kind of like what do we think about when we try and like build new systems and think about like how they can be healthy and sustainable. My co-host is Thomas Arnold, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Thomas Arnold. I am a researcher at the Tufts Institute for AI, but my background is in religious studies and philosophy of religion. So I'm read some good utopian stuff in the past. So this book was a wonderful addition to that reading history, and I'll kind of be looking at some of the religious and cultural elements to Utopia. And please, in the chat, if questions come to you, please don't hesitate to put them there. I'll be trying to monitor them there. So I'll hand it back to you, Taylor, and get us
Yeah,
started.
yeah, sounds good. Awesome. Okay, so kicking off question, how the run of the show is going to go for everybody. I don't know if you've been to an intellect salon before, but how we're going to do this one is for the first little bit, Thomas and I will kind of interview the authors with questions that we've kind of thought about from reading the book, and then we'll open up the floor to a open Q&A, and you can uh, ask whichever questions that you'd like, either by posting them in the chat and then we can read them out, or you can come off mute and ask them yourself. Um, with that, I will kick us off. So, David, you're up first. Um, how did you choose this topic to write about? And like, where does this book fit into, your broader research and thinking?
Hmm. That's a great question. I'm sure Jason will have a different answer for that second part, but um, we
You
are
can
good
take, you can
friends.
both answer.
Here we can each take a swipe at it. We are good friends, and we were also working together professionally, leading a group of students in a kind of discussion seminar in 2021, 2022, 2023 at USC called the Nova Forum. So it's a group of students coming to learn about the Catholic intellectual tradition. So we were reading Augustine together, and we were reading Thomas More together. And Jason had been doing some work on Thomas More, and we got in some conversations, and we thought, we have a lot of concerns about the way our politics is heading and how we respond to fears and anxieties we all have about the world, and our future together. And there's something new here. There's something new in this Thomas More that we didn't see before. And so it really grew organically out of conversations with students and conversations together, and was something a little bit new for both of us. Writing together, we had written together before, but kind of investing in this sort of project that pushes me out of my field of history of theology and medieval studies, and I think pushes Jason in another way toward religion in a way that he sometimes writes about, but not as much as I have. So this has been a great creative stretching for us, I think, as writers, and our friendship too. It's a new adventure. If you have a good friend, try writing a book with them. That's a good adventure to do together.
A
Yeah.
test of the friendship, maybe.
Yeah.
Indeed. We
I would
passed.
just add to that that those years that David was talking about were, of course, the lockdown years. And so
Hmm.
the sense of sort of crisis and catastrophe has been sort of mounting in social and collective life. And I think that people across the political spectrum, one thing that the left and the right agree on is that something has gone very badly wrong, or many things have gone very badly wrong. And one thing that surprised us when we were teaching the seminar on Thomas More is uh, just how much he is a figure of hope, but not in a way that's sort of sentimental or cheap. It has to do with his whole view of human life and politics, which he views in this really fascinating way as a form of, what he thinks of as serious play that came out of the Renaissance, and that humans are a playful animal, but we play in a way that has massive costs, both moral, ethical, and otherwise. And one of our major forms of play, this was a big influence on Shakespeare, is we make the world of politics that we live in. We all do it together, but it's a kind of like group theater for more. And so you're always kind of in a form of world making, and utopia is just this way of trying to imagine more hopeful forms of play or world making to guide the play that's already happening. You're already in it. And I think Dave and I and the students and a lot of Americans, people around the world have this sense of, well, something catastrophic has happened. And what we found was like a place of inspiration or an opening toward something that was different than that.
Mm. It's interesting, one of the things you mention in the book is, there's this sort of tension of play and utopia is kind of having this like imaginary, unattained quality. But, a lot of times when we think about the politics and the actual decisions on the ground, the consequences are very, very real, right? They're not just, oh, I imagine what might happen if, right? And in fact, in the introduction, you write something interesting, I think, which is that the United States is hard ground for utopians, a place that junkyards revolutionary dreams, not because utopia cannot exist here, but because millions are convinced that it has already arrived, the maximally ideal society beyond which nothing better can be imagined. And it's interesting to me because there's almost this like the unattainability of utopia, or at the very least, the sense that we haven't achieved it yet, right? There's this sort of almost moving goalpost nature to it. And that, like, whether that, do you guys think that that's kind of load bearing in its effectiveness?
Yeah, and I'll pass it on to Dave, but just since it follows from what I was saying, I would just add here. So More has a different operating metaphor for what politics is about than modern people do. We tend to think of politics as maybe a machine, or I mean, this is a bigger kind of issue, but like institutional or structural. More, and he was a huge influence on Shakespeare, which we talk about in the book, thought that politics was a very serious form of play, like theater. That would have been his operating metaphor. And so we wear costumes. Social classes wear costumes, different people, authorities wear costumes, et cetera, et cetera. So we're always involved, even adults like kids are involved in this kind of play acting. It's just that the play acting is real, it's social reality. And he was very aware of that. I mean, he was beheaded. But, and I could pass it on to Dave here, but one thing that's fascinating about him is he invented the word utopia. Maybe not everyone here realizes that, but it's a play on words. He was immensely erudite, immensely clever. He was in the highest realms of politics. He was one of the most well-known humanists in Europe in his day. And he gave us the word utopia, and it's a serious joke. It seems serious playing. It means it strictly means in the Greek, which Dave actually has and I don't, but it strictly means nowhere. So like the good society is nowhere. But it's a pun because it can also it's, phonetically it also could also mean the good place. So to your point, Taylor, there's this sense that and I'll stop here, but and just see if Dave wants to say something. But there's a sense for more in which all politics have an aspect of utopia to them because the United States has a kind of excessively idealized conception or conceptions of itself that are the nowhere that is the good place. But so do socialists, feminists, fascists, nationalists. Like there's a utopian dimension to all human politics for more, a kind of nowhere that's the most idealized form of the world that we're already living, if that makes sense. And the United States is just kind of, at least since post-war, one of the things Dave and I claim in the book is that it mainstream American ideology has sort of taken the stance of we have utopia, it's already been achieved through our institutions, culture, practices, and we just need to spread it everywhere else in the world. Dave, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, we spent some time in the back half of the book looking at some different examples of different ideologies and which ways in and the ways in which they are kind of halfway utopias or deformed utopias in some way, but they all, as Jason said, have that impulse, but then decide at different moments to put a limit of some kind on the dream, a limit of some kind in their expectations for a way of living together that would do justice to the full dignity of the human person. And it's usually done out of some sort of hesitation or concern, what we call, and others have called, realism. So, like the sense, precisely in the way that Taylor's very good question is pointing toward, is it realistic to hope for this much? Is it realistic to expect this much? And so we try to sort of pause and look at what's behind those movements of realism, psychologically, politically, ideologically, theologically, what sort of um, uh, pausing in the momentum of one's dreams for our life together, what lies behind that? And a great influence in American public life, sometimes understood, but when you read a little bit, you see it right away, is Augustine. And that's a figure that we found we had to kind of contend with. Augustine, writing in the late 300s, early 400s, an important Christian author for Protestants and Catholics, um, writing in North Africa, writing in the Roman Empire, and really grappling with the hopes for a Christian empire, the cautions of a Christian empire, the temptations, the deceptions of imperialism, and wrestling with what does that mean with this new Christian empire, which is, less than 100 years old at the time of his writing. And this idea had great influence on American political thinkers, especially Protestant and some Catholic thinkers as well, earlier in the 20th century, who are really thinking about what they called Augustinian realism, that we have to be careful not to build too high with our hopes for the earthly city, the earthly political organizations of different kinds. So that was one thing we had to kind of wrestle with. Maybe we can get into that more. But the meaning of realism and what does it mean to insist that our politics be more realistic, or to ask, as Taylor asks fairly, does this bear much weight? Is it really practical? Does it take us very far together? Does it raise more problems and questions than it's worth? Does it bring certain dangers? The threat, utopianism not is just something that's sort of either silly on one side or just sort of a jest, which is one way that more utopianism, I think we think wrongly, has been read. Something sort
Mhm.
of like a jolly invention, I think, was C.S. Lewis's term for more. Or on the other side, utopianism as a kind of threat or danger, something that's like playing with fire, with the threat of totalitarianisms that are supposedly instances of 20th century utopianism.
Yeah. It's interesting that, there's you kind of you can write these stories and especially thinking about the fiction element in Shakespeare and you know as it's progressed into today, I mean, I think a lot of the spirit is captured in sci-fi, which you also mention in the book. Um, there's we can create stories and visions and imaginings of kind of what, the our utopia might look like. But it kind of, so long as it lives only on the page, right? Like what does that do for us, right? other than kind of set our minds potentially on higher goals, maybe uplift people, give them hope. But I think that for me, that's where the tension of realism lies, right? Is not necessarily, oh, we should be realistic in our dreaming, but more along the lines of how do we make it real,
Yeah, and
right?
I'm glad you said that because one thing that's very subversive about the way Moore thinks, if you go back to him, is one aspect of utopia is the nowhere that's the good place, but the other aspect, and we talk about this, I think, in the third or second chapter or something, is world making. That Moore thinks we're always already in, there's a very strongly imaginative component to all human social life. So it's not that, oh, for him, it's not that, oh, they're the utopians over there and they're the like dreamers off the page. That's kind of a modern reception of it with the realism utopian split. Moore doesn't accept a conceptual distinction between utopia and realism in this other sense of the word. Everyone is making a world imaginatively. And what he does that's really brilliant in the dialogue is that he puts into play the world making of Europe. So this traveler shows up, Raphael Hythloday, from the New World, and that was like outer space for Renaissance humanists. It's like aliens arrived, and he just finds out that there's this island where people on Christian terms are living better lives than they are in Europe. And but from the perspective of what something more constantly does in this kind of clever way is from the perspective of the utopians, the way the Europeans are living is kind of completely outrageous and crazy. And so it probably is worth saying here that one of the things that is forgotten about Moore, because he's so remembered as a figure of like, religious freedom or conscience. He's a knighted figure within the English tradition. He's important to English nationalism. He's a canonized saint in the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that really gets lost is he had this brilliant breakthrough intellectually around the concept of utopia that we talk about in the book, which is he essentially, we think he made a conceptual breakthrough where he understood this strongly imaginative component to all human political life. And so he really is the founder of our sci-fi and fantasy genres, the world-making genres. But one of his contentions is just we're always in world-making projects. And the medieval period, for instance, or if you go back to other cultural and social worlds, they look like impossible or unrealistic. But if you told people in the medieval world, for instance, that you would have a weekend, right? Like a weekend with limits on labor, which is something that appears in More's Utopia, they'd be like, what? Or education of both sexes, which appears in Utopia, they'd be like, what are you trying to explode the social order? But we have that now. So like the realism of today is the utopia of yesterday and vice versa. So I guess the one thing I'm really trying to say here is one thing that's really brilliant about Moore is he kind of doesn't accept our later realist versus utopian split because he sees human political life as an imaginative, playful activity. So like there's no outside of utopia for him. There's no outside of world making. And this will look like an absurd world to a later generation. And it does look like an absurd world to people sometimes in other cultures that it's hard with globalization now, but if you meet people in other social worlds, like if you encountered an indigenous tribe, more would like this example in the Amazon rainforest that's still untouched, they'd be like, what? Wait, you guys take out the trash every day and you fill a dump with garbage at the end of it, like that's a sustainable way to live. Why do you do that? Um,
Yeah. Um, I loved the term in your book, and I don't know whether this was your own term or whether you picked it up from somewhere else, but this cosmopoesis for world building, I find it like really I find it very evocative as kind of capturing this the scope of what this entails, right? It's not just this like tiny pocket, it's the whole cosmos of what you're trying to imagine. Um,
Yeah, and that's a great sort of one-word summary. I think it comes out of Jason's work actually of what Moore's translation of the idea of the human being as being made in the image of God. So if God is a creator, essentially, then the human being is a creator, essentially. And God makes a world and the human being makes a world, sort of in their DNA, in their essence, constitutively. So that's an interesting aspect of Moore's Christian humanism, which is not just about sort of his appreciation of text and antiquity, his friendship with Erasmus and so forth, but this vision of the human being is almost as a kind of having an infinite plasticity of always being kind of evolving towards something different and grander in a different way than we might expect. So yeah, we love that word too.
It was it really struck me when I read it. I found it beautiful. Um, so I'm gonna push us in a direction, which is to say, you have the word manifesto on the front of your book, and it definitely has a political perspective of its own. Um, and one of the things that it does, you very explicitly critique, is the current like abundance movement in the US, as an example of a closed utopia, since it focuses on material abundance without necessarily pushing for moral transformation, alongside that. Um, from like maybe I'm wrong here, but for me, the material abundance piece feels somewhat desirable by consensus, right? I don't think people would argue that, safe and comfortable homes for everybody, sufficient, nutritious, cruelty-free food, or, cheap renewable energy are like bad things that we don't want to have. But the thing that kind of feels more contentious to me is this moral transformation point. Um, whose values and moral framework get to govern utopia, right? To borrow phrases that, are in the text, like who gets to play the role of the patient parent and who, gets cast as the wayward child, who needs to tutor their desires, right? Like how that feels like a much more kind of contentious piece than, let's give everybody a comfortable life, or at least as many people as possible.
Yeah, I'll give Dave the uncomfortable question.
We'll
Yeah,
hear a bit
Oh,
too.
you're still on mute.
Got it. One thing we wrestle with that comes up in a lot of the literature about utopianism, about concerns about utopianism, is a problem of transition. So, of course, we all want to have, more accessible and lower cost healthcare and all the goods that Taylor outlined. And the question is, how do we get there? And does utopia help us with that in one way or the other? And I think we had sort of two insights as we were writing that at least I found very helpful in getting my head around this problem of how do we get there. One is that we have to focus on the actual human beings who will be inhabiting a world with, let's say, greater material abundance. We have lots of examples of some human beings currently inhabiting, maybe ourselves, we can say, kind of demographically, of course, here we are on Zoom with the leisure to do this. But so some of us having this tremendous abundance at present. And the question is like, how are we bearing that ourselves? How are we sharing that with others? What is the kind of human community and what capacities do we have to live in that world without it becoming something damaging to ourselves or to others? So the material abundance itself is sort of not enough to describe what it would take to make that transition. And the other side of the transition question, we learned a lot from a sociologist named Eric Olin Wright, Envisioning Real Utopias, where he talks about the need to start with something concrete, local, immediate, and realizable. And it really is a kind of, I'm not sure he had this in mind, but as a perfect manifestation of More's idea of cosmopoiesis, where the human beings are dreaming into reality some small but concrete and real moment of utopianism. And he has this beautiful image of them kind of connecting up as a series of, micro networks and expanding in that way. So that's, I hope, a little bit to speak to your concerns about exactly who is in charge. This is not envisioned as a kind of top-down, immediate revolution. In fact, sometimes it's authors on the left or the right in ideological variants that describe their vision for a sudden transition of one kind to the other. That's sort of one mistake that can be made. But the other mistake is just to assume that if we fix the material abundance with the comforts that we need to live well, that we will then kind of automatically, structurally become people who are living well without any further ado and with any other further questions about who are we and how did we learn how to be human and from whom and with whom and toward what end. And those are difficult questions to adjudicate, but I think to sort of capture the full value of utopian thinking, we'd have to get there at some point.
And can I just add here, because there's utopia in the broad sense that Moore uses it, and that's sort of like this cosmopoiesis, everyone's involved. But then there's the narrow sense of the yet not yet achieved society that is the good place that reflects a dwelling place worthy of humans as world makers, right? And that thicker, narrower concept, which Dave and I are, defenders of or advocates of or want to vindicate, is essentially a form of humanism. And whether you're religious or not, there's a shared space there for humanism, like you were saying, who gets to decide. And I just want to add to Dave's points here, just a couple things really fast. One is that part of what emerges out of Moore's humanism is that we're only going to finally have this society that's human to the human if we're oriented in our desires in a way to goods that are not necessarily just material, but are contemplative. So if you go back to Moore's text or just the humanists in general, they thought our higher form capacities were things like dialogue, like the interintellect thing you guys do, art, music, where if I share guitar playing with my son, say, there's not less guitar playing in the world, there's more, right? Because it's a higher order capacity that we share that we become excellent at. And the problem with abundance utopias is they're very much in the thrall of materialist goods that are by their nature finite, unless you have some. Part of those utopias is they build in this notion of like inexhaustibility, and they're left and right versions of that. Think of a right version of that where Elon Musk wants to take us to Mars. But yeah, Ezra Klein, like, oh yeah, somehow technology will give us so much material stuff that we won't have a problem. That strikes me as very perilous in light of ecology. Like we're going to need to orient ourselves. I'm not saying, but in Moore's notion of utopia, there's this idea, there's a critique of luxury. You could put it that way. I think he'd be comfortable with that term. And the abundance utopias are very naive about what luxury does to your desires and the need to always have a comparative social position that's more than somebody else. Like I own this, but you own that. And part of humanism as a project, that thicker, narrower project, is to educate human desires away from luxury, which is hard because we get addicted to them, and toward these goods of friendship that are humanistic, that if you share them, you have more of them, you don't have less of them. And if you go back to Moore's Utopia, they wear very simple clothing. They don't care about money. They don't care about precious gems and stones. What they care about is leisure, games, conversation, um, uh, philosophical discussion, literature, So, um, who gets to decide is actually less a problem within Moore's utopia of like a person saying, do this, do that, and more an issue of what's the shared space of humanists and what's the goal of humanism, if you see what I'm saying, and what's your count of humanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that popped into my mind as I was kind of grappling with this question was something that's kind of happening in my life right now that my question was like, how does this thing that's very important to me, how would that fit into Moore's utopia? Um, which is that I have a rug in my house. Um, it is an heirloom rug from my husband's grandma who immigrated to the US from the Soviet Union after being kind of on the run, trying to escape persecution, and she picked it up somewhere along her travels, and it made its way to the US, and eventually now we have it. And she has sadly passed on. But on the way, this rug became quite damaged, and sort of fraying on the edges. It's got a rip down the middle. And I'm currently working on a project to kind of like hand stitch and mend this rug and, you know, make it more durable so that we can continue to have it in our home and that it will last a long time. And I kind of look at this feels like a very humanistic project to me, right? I feel like it's connecting with a lot that makes me feel like a human. and a lot of things that I value. But I look at More's utopia and I say, okay, well, there's no private property there. So would I even be able to have a rug that's mine? I have to swap homes with someone every 10 years. So, like, does the rug stay behind? Will the next family that comes in even care about the rug at all? Right? The story of how it came into my possession is completely irrelevant to them. They don't really have any attachment to that. They don't have, the family connection or anything. And it's kind of like an old rug with like a hand-stitched visible mend down the middle, right? It's not like a pristine and beautiful object. It's just meaningful to me. And so this was the story where I was kind of like, well, here's something that I value that I don't feel like is a bad value or like a non-humanistic value, but it kind of clashes once you put it into try and like how do I wedge it into this utopia?
Hmm.
That's a good one. Yeah, I don't think the for myself, um the text doesn't have it's not an omnibus of all answers of what what we need for our life together. It contains lots of important insights, and it's I think a lot of insights that because of different histories in our 20th century before are kind of been blocked or misunderstood in ways, and we're kind of making an appeal to understand it for the resources that it has. Not by any means saying it's the encyclopedia of all
Right.
things that has the
Of
answers.
course.
But I think, for example, one thing that you described very beautifully there is the supreme importance in a human life of having time for leisure, reflection, and creative pursuits. And not as something that sort of you're allowed to do at the end of the day, or something that is sort of an optional add-on to your life, like in the weekend space or after 5 p.m., but something that's really at the heart of being human, much more radically. And so I think all of what you described is that sort of project, whether it's that, for me, it's like fruitless cooking endeavors that are not really for anyone's particular meal, but just so that I enjoy. For others, it might be writing or music or whatever it might be. And more takes that creativity and that sort of leisurely creativity as a human being, which we all kind of naturally do. I hope we all do in a vacation space when we have our time to ourselves. And he puts it at the center of a communal life. And so he envisions, for example, just some details that we were really arrested by. The people who are recovering in the hospital, they're the ones who get the five-star Michelin restaurant dinner. The education is not just something reserved for the young, but is like the luxury of the human being in any period of life to continue learning for learning's sake. So things like this that I think actually connect quite strongly with that kind of experience that you just described very beautifully.
Can I also add that so in the text, Morris, who's Morris like parallel character who's in Utopia, it's very like it sounds like postmodernism, but it's before postmodernism. But Morris objects at the end to Raphael and he says, we shouldn't get rid of private property. And he gives Aristotle's famous objections to Platonic communism. But to Dave's point, what's interesting about Morris, he lives in a pre-ideological age in the sense of the modern ideologies. So his notion of utopia is more playful than our politics. We basically think we get the one maximally right vision with policies built in and blueprints, et cetera. And then we all mobilize around it. Conservatives, liberals, et cetera, and we mobilize around it. That's not Moore's view at all. Moore thinks that there are unforeseen moves, and any one move could be, taken away. And so utopia isn't so much about any one policy. They're all sort of up for grabs. What isn't up for grabs is the ethical commitment. What would make you utopian in the thick, narrower sense that we're interested in is the ethical commitment to make a society that's finally more human to the human. But, for instance, Dave and I drop the, strict Platonic communism. In the later chapters, there's envisioning of the market, and this is not original to us, but like as democratized. So more things would be communally owned. But what we don't have in mind is, in fact, we're quite critical of Karl Marx. I mean, Marxism is interesting like counterpoint to us. We're inspired by it in some ways. We're very critical and leery of it in some ways. One thing we're very leery of is Marx, in a way, has this kind of blueprint view that, communism will create the human society without ethical transformation, by the way. So one thing we say in the book, in the bad utopias section, is one of the reasons Marxism kept going bad is because it didn't have ethical transformation, it just had a structural transformation and policies that were supposed to create the good society, but they didn't have good people. They still had the same people, still addicted to material goods, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, one thought is we both Moore and us for different reasons would not be committed to whatever the vision there is of Marxist communism where you don't have your own rug. But with more, we would be in favor of let's think of different ways in which we already share goods that Dave was talking about that might creatively expand our sense of world at the workplace. And we could talk about these because this sounds very vague, but in the book are very concrete examples of ways in which the workplace could look different, schools could look different without um, the abolition of private property entirely, if you see what I mean, just more shared goods. So more could be said about that, but the book doesn't advocate for communism or the abolition of private property, and neither did Moore, actually. Moore didn't argue for any one policy. Yeah.
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 Um, I'm going to pass over to Thomas. I know he has some questions that I think will directly relate into some of these examples that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think that really leads into what I wanted to delve into. I really appreciated the concrete instances, especially apropos given your LA, Southern California location around the Catholic worker movement in LA. Though you do tell a little bit of its history. The Homeboy Industries, also Father Gregory Boyle. But the Catholic worker, I have a personal kind of connection to because of a Protestant effort in Atlanta that was very much inspired by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, called Open Door Community. And it was quite utopian in terms of an alternative whole space that they set up in the city to um, really give an alternative to homelessness as the product of society. And so I think there was a similar urge that there wasn't about that number of housing units. You had to change the very relationships that society had as patterns. And I remember one of their movements, as a college student, that seemed it was not the grand dialectic of society or abundance or anything. It was public restrooms, pee for free with dignity. That was one of their things because the the community, that was a huge issue, embodied physical, real, because of the way that Atlanta was set up to say some people should not be in public, some people, and we're going to do everything we can to get them out of that space. A kind of a different way of saying a no space, a no topos for them. And so I'd love to hear more, just because uh, to me there is this tension between transformation and intimacy and the community that comes from real relationships, that concreteness, and these larger questions of without a blueprint and without a grand history, but along the same lines of, okay, where do things start to pivot in terms of scale? Like where do things begin to take on a larger, reverberate outward from those moments, and not just stay in the within the limits where larger forces can kind of isolate it and attack it. So um, take that wherever you would like to go, Dave, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah, we were excited to bring up some of the examples from Homeboy Industries. And I guess we're all in different cities. We're in Los Angeles, and Homeboy Industries is a movement started by a Jesuit priest, Father Gregory Boyle. He's still working, although he's been there for many years now. And he just said, I think the answer to gang recidivism in East LA, where he was working as a priest in his community and worried about gang violence, the answer is employment and we're just going to start our own microeconomies effectively. And so that's now expanded into a whole different range of industries that they're doing. They don't worry about productivity. They don't begin from a place of scarcity. Kind of ironically, the business is booming and they're spinning off multiple. It's become a sort of one of the early instances of like a nonprofit incubator across 7 or 8 different projects now, as I understand it. So that's something that's in the city. I mean, what I want to say to Thomas's good question is um, about scale, is that Moore's insight would be the scale question, and even part of the transition question, it doesn't only pass through technical ability or through kind of market exerted power. It also has to pass through, not as an option, not as a luxury, not as a sort of nice thought, but it has to pass through the imagination. And there have to be people who see the instance on the ground, as we were, just as observers in our city, and you say, wow, that stimulates my imagination. I didn't think that was possible. I really didn't think that was possible. But because someone began it as a real utopia, the second step is you respond with kind of wonder and you feel a dream arise about a different way of thinking what the city could be. And so, to sort of use, it's almost like a metaphor of contagion, I think, through the imagination, much maybe the same bathroom example. Bathroom justice in that sense for people to have dignity in the city, as Thomas was laying out, that could easily inspire another movement in another city. And so it's not sort of a technocratic model of expansion and scaling, but one that passes through a dream. So we try to really always come back to, the flip side of cosmopoiesis is dreaming. And not dreaming as something that's in an entertainment science fiction space or something that's in a purely poetic space, but one which is cosmopoietic, which is world making, which means it's concrete, it has hard edges, it has a sort of tangible reality to it. It really changed someone's biological comfort in their city because that first step was taken. So I think that's an important way to think about scale. I mean, Eric Olin Wright has a whole bunch of more technical analyses, which I find very sound, and I commend to all of you envisioning real utopias, where he talks about the transition problem and how you sort of encounter a downward sloping curve of inefficiency when you're on the way towards scaling a certain legal or financial measure that would bring greater justice to society in a utopian direction. But Moore's insight, just to complement Wright on that point, would be that you have to engage the imagination. And that involves not just a kind of policy imagination, it involves a deep anthropological imagination about what does it mean to be a human, inevitably, unavoidably. And for us, we don't get into this in all the chapters, but at least from what I work on, I think it also always engages some sort of theological imagination. And I would say that whether someone's privately themselves, religious or not religious, but imagination at the highest level of what do we hope for together? Why are we here? What are we doing together? What do we think our future entails? The highest and broadest questions we can ask. So it very quickly leads to those things.
Can I just add here, and thank you for that question, Thomas, that so a difference between Morean humanism and its utopianism, that to just draw a contrast with Marxism, is the whole notion that revolutionary change through structural change is going to get you what you want is like a non-starter for More, right? So you need the micro work of new neighborhoods, new cities, new friendships. And for More, the reason utopia doesn't happen begins with me. I don't take a step or an action together with other people. And so we get frozen at the level, I think, from a Morean perspective of like big structures, whereas he thinks as any enduring change as having to begin with neighborhoods, friendships, cities. He's in Western political thought. This is the small r, not having to do with the major party by the same name, Republican tradition, which
Yeah.
the city plays such a big role, right? As kind of a hub, and we definitely are working within that tradition, but it's kind of like a tipping point. I mean, it's a totally fair question. It's just that on Moore's view, or within this tradition we're working on, change happens gradually from the bottom up and not from the top down through, this state. This state itself could be replaced in all its functions or institutions. The market itself, if you had all firms that were owned in forms of friendship around practices where profits were shared, you could have a market, but the market would no longer be organized in the way. So we talk about that in the book, of course,
Yeah.
but it's just a different model for how enduring change happens than the one that's typical of both liberalism and Marxism, where it's like structural top down, the state changes, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's a really helpful formulation and certainly picks up on, I'm thinking of Jim Wallace, who I remember hearing him say, you look at the data and the evidence, then you know, imagine, you act, and then you watch the data change. The idea of you have to be, your imagination is leading out ahead of empiricism at points. And so that kind of leads into my question around the imagination. And so for this question, why don't I see if I've learned from you all? Why don't I try out to answer my question along the lines that you have, and then you can tell me where you would take it instead. But my question that I'm sure you have gotten and will get is really around religion as a place that has such a formative role in the imagination and has such powerful narratives. And I know that you all could have written, for those of you that have not yet read the book and you need to read the book, it's taking on the heaviest of themes, but doing so in a really uh, uh, approachable and engaging writing style. And one chapter is on Martin Luther King and talking about Washington, D.C. versus Memphis. And I could almost feel, you all could have clearly written on Memphis and King's last speech there, which has all of the promised land imagery and Moses imagery and not being able to see the promised land as Moses didn't. But it's because of the power of those things that, I do wonder about um, conflicting religious narratives. That's my abstract question. The way that I would answer it, given what you all have said, would you say that the Morean view is a bottom-up approach, which means that we don't know ahead of time how these narratives might take shape in eclectic ways or syncretic ways? Uh, but we have to have kind of a broad humanism or a faith that those stories will, um, instead of being hidden, need to be put out on the table and you know uh, tested or be material for collaboration and be a more open-ended combination of how something could be both formative and normative in cultivating our desires, but not necessarily something that we have to solve ahead of time philosophically of which tradition or which. Um, I mean, I'm thinking of Alistair McIntyre kind of moving from a Marxist view into really trying to pay attention to these close communities and not trying to figure out everything on the grand level. Am I on the right track there in terms of how you would approach some of these questions, trying to get into the Morean perspective?
Dave, you want me to go? Okay, well, then I'll just say very briefly, yes, you are. And I mean, I think humanism is the shared space around religious pluralism, right? So yeah, this is very long tradition in humanism that humanists can hope for more humanistic variants of the various world religions to emerge. Like, meaning forms of the religion from within its own resources and theologies in ways that I wouldn't know. I'm not Muslim, but I can hope for a more humanistic Islam. I am a Christian. I can hope for and do my part in trying to help cultivate and strengthen a more humanistic Christianity, meaning that its commitments are not sectarian, but are to the intrinsic value of humans, whether they're religious or not. And in fact, one of the humbling things for anyone interested in the history of humanism is the way in which it's sometimes been taken much further by non-religious people than it was ever taken by religious people in ways that are awe-inspiring. I mean, an example Charles Taylor always brings up, the Canadian philosophers, Doctors Without Borders. Like you might applaud that because you have, certain sources in, I don't know, Protestant theology or just secular humanism, but you might be moved by the fact that a doctor would go across the globe to someone they don't speak the language, they don't risk their lives, expose themselves to contagion just to help them get better. And I admire that. And so that's the sort of space. And what I think Dave and I are just speaking out of our tradition theologically, but we're trying to write a book in which humanism is the shared space. And I don't know what you want to say about that, David.
Yeah, I agree, and I think Thomas's answer is on the mark. Let me say two things. I mean, one is More's idea of utopia as the good place that is no place. It has this sort of dialectical energy. It's never fully realized. And for him, it's clear in the pages of the book when you read Utopia. Also, when you read, we write quite a bit at the second half of the book about one of his last works, the Dialogue on Tribulation. But he's writing out of his Christian faith in a very intimate way. But it's a vision of a social order that is unrealizable in a way. And so it never becomes sort of so definite that it could be, and the one that we're, worried about in a liberal order is the imposition of a certain religious vision of things by force. For More, it's never such a definite formulation that it could be kind of coherently imposed. It's naturally supposed to be growing, expanding, organically being dreamed, not fully realized, not fully there, only realized in the moment of practice, not ideologically. So that's part of it. But the deeper answer, I think, and this is where More is getting, this is sort of More's great formulation of utopia, but something we learned in the writing of the book, utopia, in More's sense, is kind of a one-word configuration or concentration of Augustine's idea of the two cities. So Augustine of Hippo, this important North African bishop, Christian author from the 300s that I mentioned before, he writes a work um, after the fall of the Roman Empire. It's kind of a 9/11 moment for Christianity. He's reflecting on this, and he proposes that there are two cities. There's the earthly city, the one that we all live in together, and there's the heavenly city. But very importantly, and this goes to Thomas's point, even Augustine says, although many readers of Augustine forget this, Augustine says explicitly, the heavenly city, the ideal city, is not the Christian community. So for anyone who's in a Christian community, that's patently obvious, right? That like the Christian community is not the heavenly city. One's religious community is not the ideal place. It's the place where you dream of the no place, which is not there, right? It's the place for utopian dreaming that hosts it or that performs not a final blueprint, but performs in its rituals a dream of a city which is not here. The city of God, he says, the heavenly city. So that sort of push and pull for Augustine, I think it's kind of coded into More's idea of utopia. It's on the one hand, a very maximalist dreaming. On the other hand, it has a kind of critical force to say, but we're not there yet, no matter where you arrive, but we're still not there yet. And then something amazing is realized. And then you say, but we're still not there yet either. So it has a sort of push and pull dialectically, which doesn't map on very neatly, I think, to any particular religious place that one might begin, certainly not Christianity. And that's some Augustinian wisdom that More would have known, very well himself as a great reader.
Yeah, I appreciate that connection, and it's yeah, really good thread to follow through. Taylor, I think at this point, maybe we should open up. I know you've got
Yeah.
a question or two that I'd love for you to get to because I've seen them and they're really good. But
Message me in the chat, tell me which one. But yeah, I was thinking maybe it's a good time to open up the floor. If anyone in the room has questions, you can either ask them in the chat or use the little raise hand function and ask them live. And then we'll probably, I mean, we have so many questions that we've prepared for this, so we can always hop back in and close things out down the line. But yeah, for now, does anyone have anything that's sort of come to mind Um, don't be shy.
While people are, oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, don't be shy.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, if people are looking over notes or still thinking, Taylor, I'd love to hear about the biosphere.
Oh yeah.
Similar.
David, did you have a David
Yeah,
Barrelon? Do you
yes,
have a
I was going
question?
to ask, hi, Taylor. Um, I was going to ask, how much can I live in a utopian fashion in a society by myself? I mean, can I comport myself in the way that I would imagine others would comport themselves in a utopian setting satisfactorily?
It's a great question. Henry
Yeah,
Thoreau really tried, didn't he? Are you going to sort of like go to Walden type of thing, or?
But I think his mother
or
brought
even
him
you could
lunch.
do it this. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could do it in the city too. I mean, I think it's a matter of how you choose to comport yourself, even, um, and maybe present yourself as an example. I'm thinking of the the transition problem. Uh, you know, if utopia was never going to arrive, does that give you license to be an asshole?
Hmm.
Uh,
No, but I mean, yes, people go on being assholes, including myself sometimes. But I mean, it's a great question. I think that Moore's understanding is that utopia is an irreducibly social or political concept. So it'd almost be like a different thing. That's why I brought up Thoreau, because obviously he kind of stands against the grain of this, though sometimes I've been critical of Thoreau and Walden in that I think it's essentially a social project that doesn't own itself as such. He's like writing notes all the time. He's there alone, but he's like writing love/hate letters to society. I mean, I admire Thoreau, so I'm not trying to be too hard on him, but there's a sort of Lockean individualist streak to him that I don't think is particularly salutary. He's trying to do something social, but he's not completely aware of it. But Thoreau is my example, not yours. But I think Moore would say the question: can you be a good person by yourself? Like separate from your social and political relations. There might be more realizability of being a good person, but not totally because we're implicated in the sort of relationships that we're in, right? So it's either something we do together or not. Just to be really concrete. So Thomas, that was a great
Yeah.
example, by the way. I'd love to hear more about that group in Atlanta. But if there are people who are so hard pressed to find somewhere to just use the bathroom in my city, which unfortunately is very true of Los Angeles, we have a huge problem with.
yeah,
Um,
it's true all over.
Right. And it's rapidly increasing in the United States, right? And the decline of water fountains and stuff like that, a movement for public potable water that you could drink. But if there's no, in Moore's view, I'm kind of implicated in the world making play of a place we built together, all together, where there are bathrooms for me in my house, there are bathrooms in the mall, there are bathrooms in the nice restaurant, there are bathrooms if I look a certain way and I show up and I'm nice about it. But there aren't bathrooms for other people, right? And so, in that sense, I'm not part of the place that's human to the human yet. I'm doing whether just by like floating along or actively, I'm part of the sort of, and hence the sort of first move of utopia in this playful sense being finding a real utopia and attaching yourself to it. Hence, like all these examples in the book, like Greg Boyle or Martin Luther King or Dorothy Day, where what keeps this from just being like imaginative sentimentalism is some people go and make the first move. Like they start building bathrooms for people or they start offering hospitality. That's Dorothy Day's houses, where you just offered food no matter what. You are a guest. If you need food, no questions asked, we serve you food. Um, so that sort of first step thing, right? And we're born into a cosmopoetic play where we own some of the world that we're playing in. We're wearing the costumes, we're, doing the roles. I'm doing the role of college professor and upper middle class guy, with both its good and bad sides to it. I don't know, but do you want to come back, David, at that?
Yeah, yeah. I'll just offer a quick anecdote about the bathroom thing. The a city in where I did not have that problem was Istanbul because there are so many mosques, and all of the mosques have a public bathroom.
Mhm.
The expectation is you'll leave a small coin, um, which I'm sure that people who can do and people who can't aren't expected to.
Wonderful. And
Uh,
just to upset all my co-religionists, like shame on American churches that each one doesn't have its bathroom open and doesn't
mhm.
joyfully, even if it's difficult, then clean the toilets. Because we all know what that comes with, because they're compounded by all sorts of complex social problems. Because then there's the person going in and using drugs in the bathroom and blah, blah, blah. But like shame on us that we can't offer that, I think more would say.
I,
Yeah.
I'm on the board of trustees of my local library, and that's a problem we're having is that it's the place where unhoused people uh, can come, even in our small suburban library. And it's a real issue.
Yeah.
Can I pick up a thread from
Thank
what
you.
in David's question that I really appreciated when if I heard you right, you said, could I be a utopian by myself and be a kind of example for others, amidst the transition? I think that's very insightful and connects a lot with Moore's understanding and a lot of what we try to develop in the book around the way that utopias emerge concretely through practices. And this is an Aristotelian insight, and it's sort of developed classically in the last century by Alistair MacIntyre. But the idea that an example has to be observed by a student or a follower. But a student or a follower needs the example of a teacher or an exemplar to pattern themselves after. This is the way that we transmit reality to each other. It's through learned practices by those who are better at being, So, if your library is better than my library, then mine should look to yours and learn how to share its resources more charitably and imitate that. One corollary of that we get into in the book is that friendship at some level or some kind of belonging or some sort of kinship is part and parcel with utopianism. And in a really kind of uncanny way, Moore had very close, intimate friendships, not just with his family and famously his daughter, but also with Erasmus. King's circle of close friends, Day's partnership with Peter Moore. I mean, so it sort of goes part and parcel that these close collaborations where friendship itself is a kind of utopian space where you share these goods. So maybe if Taylor's working on her rug, but if it was someone who was a close friend who was dear enough to her, it would give her equal joy to give that away to a friend for their home, right? In this sort of sharing of property. So I think that's a really good question about can you be a solo utopian? And it was almost like in the framing of it, it came out that the answer is no, but because to model and to dream a better way of living together is to already reach out to someone that you can model that for, you
If,
know.
that's wonderful, David. If I could just make a real quick plug here, one thing that is in the book, if this is sounding very woolly to people, is hard examples of people who took the step to form and intensify their forms of association and practice with each other in really concrete ways. And so then they were able to share more. And I think the one thing that we have a crisis of, and that Dave and I think there's a crisis of, is we call it the virtuoso dreamers. Like we're bad at dreaming because we're damaged. We're addicted to luxury. We're alienated. There's various forms of mental illness. It's hard for us to be friends in the utopian sense of friendship. And so, like to David's point, we do need to recover even some of these that are dead models, like Thomas More or like Martin Luther King or Dorothy Day. But Father Greg Boyle's still alive, and there are others. They're the unspoken sort of friends that we talk about in every practice, the like selfless coach, not the showboat, Ronaldo or Messi or whatever, but the guy who he really loves his practice, and he thinks the more of soccer he gives, the more people play it, the more their higher human capacities are engaged. We talk about how the heroes of practice are sometimes not the most famous members of a community or of a friendship. They're the people that are most selflessly devoted to the goods of that practice.
And following up on that idea of the circle of friendship, Taylor and her husband all would know that they could always go visit the rug if they gave it away to their friend.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Derek.
Yeah, I think this is maybe a different way of coming at the question that you were just discussing, but something that I think a lot about with Utopia is that Utopia is often talking about, I mean, in its formulation is a place. It is the good nowhere. But there's also a relationship to human nature, and there's this question of is human nature fixed or developing? That like Utopia ideally is a place where people get to be the fullest expression of themselves, or is a place that allows them to improve. But I suppose my question is what is the relationship between like different theories of human nature in regards to utopia? Like, is it do we need to become different people in order to make utopia? Do we need to make utopia in order to become different people? And whether or not you just, I suppose, generally have thoughts on that, which does sound like it really ties into what David was asking about.
That's a great question. I have something on that, David, but do you want to say
Go
something?
ahead. Go ahead.
Well, what I have to say about that is there's almost this like philosophically bootstrapping element to more, which I find kind of philosophically elegant and interesting, which is the ethical criteria come out of the anthropological criteria, to sound a little technical for a minute. So the fact that we're world makers, we're cosmopoetic, which, you can bracket the theological background there, and you could just, for secular humanist anthropological reasons, think we're cultural creators, we make our own worlds of meaning, etc. That's what actually generates for more the ethical element, which is, so what would it look like to make a world in which world makers could fully realize their worlding or something like that? And so that's a rather weird way of describing humanism, but humanism is committed to the idea that humans are different, ethically relevant within the order of things. Not that other things aren't relevant, but that part of what makes humans ethically significant is that they can realize higher order capacities that are good in and of themselves. So we tend to think of these things as the higher things we do. Or More would have thought of them this way. Aristotle, other humanists, like game playing, arts, etc. Some of the other examples I said. So now the tricky thing is, and I find more very fascinating on this, to your point about do we need to become different kinds of selves, is precisely because we're world-making selves, we can make worlds in which we interpret ourselves as selves that don't do justice to ourselves. So it just seems realistic to take like an example to bash that, greed is good, or that I'm a self-interested preference maximizer, which comes out of mainstream neoclassical economics. And it just looks like a descriptive claim. Moore's view would be that's false. We can become that role of the sort of Ayn Randian, I'm out for myself to maximize and be a creator of wealth that might then trickle down to other people. But that's just one possible world for us. What we actually are this sort of theatrical worlding animal. And that form of worlding doesn't fully capture what's actually special about us. What's special about us isn't our self-interestedness. That's only one possibility for us. So one thing that's tricky is the worlds that we live in are so englobing for more that we can really be deceived into perceiving something imaginative as the real. And so that's how we get trapped in our realisms for more or that's David and Mai's gloss on more that we then make a lot out of, which is that we can be trapped in the world of the real, which is just our cultural form of cosmopoetic play that has become almost indistinguishable for us from our sense of self. But that's part of how we end up in dystopia or catastrophe or bad utopia for David and for me, which is that we start to interpret ourselves in degraded or lesser ways that don't meet the standard of our cosmopoetic play, if that makes sense.
If I can just add one interesting parallel and parable from the 15th century Italian humanist Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And in the Oration on the Dignity of Man, it's a short text. More knew it. It sort of captures in a word the idea of cosmopoiesis or world making as a human essence. And in this sort of parable, God creates all the creatures, gives them each their essence. God creates the angels, give them their separate essence. And then the human being shows up and says, what am I supposed to get? And God says, I've given all the essences away. So your essence is going to have to be to have no essence in that sense, or to be plastic, to be changeable, to be mutable. And you are going to have to decide your fate about whether you become the human that is the beast or the human that is the angel, so that you have a sort of freedom to become the creature that you wish to be. And that's what it means to be human. So in that sense, I think reflected in very much what Jason said in more kind of concrete ways, it's one of the images that underlies Moore's understand. So he would say, to Derek's question, that the human being, to be a human is to be radically open, and that your own conceptions of who you are is part of who you are and can change who you are, in fact.
Can I just say also that Shakespeare was a great admirer of Thomas More? I know we have another hand up, but he started a play on him, didn't finish it. His Richard III is based on Thomas More's Richard III. And you see that, I think we quote the Hamlet speech, right, David, in the book, the one about,
Yeah.
what a piece of work is man,
Mm.
read that and go back to Hamlet, the what a piece of work is man speech. Shakespeare was probably a humanist. I mean, he contains multitudes, but I interpret him as a humanist. A lot of people do. That speech says something very similar to what David just said, which, and then it ends with man delights me not, because Hamlet's depressed out of his mind because Denmark is a prison and there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Um, but it starts with this like, very high vision of what humans can become, and then says, oh, but we can become lower and worse than all the animals. Like we're the worst and the best animal.
Um, Amy?
Thank you so much for sharing all these ideas. I jumped in at the last minute, so I appreciate learning so many things. I took some notes, and I really, what I really was blown away by was the idea that imagination creates the world, and I think that for me, yeah, I think I agree because it's just because it created my world. Whatever you dream of, you make that happen, and I think that's amazing. But I wanted to just ask you get a take on this. Can if in Utopia can there be crime? And if that's the first thing. And then the second thing was in order to create Utopia in the transition period, do we is war even something that could even happen? Because if you are doing things with a means to an end, the means to create utopia should not include violence, I'm thinking. So just wanted to get your take on those
I
things.
have like something urgent jumping out of my throat here, David, but do you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay, because the thing I have is it's a great question. Because what makes more enduring than like Elysium or all these myths that we still, or it's not that they're more enduring because we still remember Elysium or these different garden mythologies that come out of the religions of the world. Or there's what's the medieval one, David, where you get like there's rivers that are made of like chocolate or not chocolate, but like wine,
Yes, I'm forgetting the name, but
like
yes,
Cockney or something like that. But
Arcane. Yeah.
yeah, but in any case, one thing that's very fascinating about Moore and the reason why he's remained important to a lot of different social and political movements, I mean, he was taken up in a big way by socialists of various stripes and things, is his brand of utopianism is realistic in the sense that when he describes utopia, there's still bad stuff going on in it. And there's a question like, why? I mean, it's like he already pre-contained the concept of dystopia in Utopia. He is considered the sort of precursor, like I said, to both science fiction and fantasy literature, video game world making, et cetera, et cetera. Um, he included people still commit crimes. There's a whole thing on punishments and what punishments you'll need. So what he doesn't assume is the sort of Elysium field where you don't have scarcity anymore, you don't have human finitude, you don't have problems, and that's one of the reasons why Moore's variant of this has been difficult for people to get rid of, even when they want to, because it's more realistic in that sense, right? And it touches on a lot of different things we've talked about in this conversation. One being that for Moore, utopia is never here yet. It's a first move, or it's always here and it's not here yet. And so you're always in this form of play. And part of the issue is what kind of a person am I? Am I ethically there yet myself? And some days I am, and some days I'm not, right? So, um, you, the he doesn't expect moral perfectibility. He expects us to still continue to be the same people. The problem is, how do we become people that are capable of, through our habits, more frequently or in new ways, evoking? It's almost, I heard this is, I wish this were ours, but a scholar of Moore, I forget his name, but has this great essay where he says, Moore invented a game where it's just the first move, but it's an open game. It's not a solved game. They talk now on the internet a lot about solved games versus open games. Utopia is an open game. It doesn't have a solution. And Moore just made the first move. And then you can chuck anything out you want. If you don't like the collective property, fine. If you think the clothes scheme was bad, fine. If you think, but like what it does not assume is perfectibility or angelic, we're still humans, basically.
Yeah, he's suspicious of finality and closure. And one thing that we found was an interesting synchrony between his intuitions and his own personal faith was that religions have imaginations that are very big and open-ended and dream without limits of space and time and goodness as among their other faults as well. Um, to address Amy's question, if I can just add something, I think, as Jason said, the book itself, Utopia, countenances crime, just punishment, war, mercenaries, etc. It's always aiming at solutions to those endemic problems which are worthy of the dignity of human beings. So it sort of looks at the current way crime is dealt with horror, and then imagines a different way to deal with crime. So it's not like there is no crime, like the Chocolate Rivers model, but there is crime, but it's dealt with in a humane way. In other words, when there's moments of negativity in a social organism, it's the response is not despair, but it's something more hopeful. And that's the sort of hope aspect to get to the other part of the book. When we started the book, if I can let you in behind the scenes a bit, we really were just focused on More's Utopia. And as we wrote, we really came to terms with, I remember one long conversation we had. I think it was driving up from San Diego back to LA, which is very long. And on the way, we realized, there's this other book that Moore wrote called A Dialogue in Tribulation, which is at the end of his life, written in jail after he's in house arrest. He's been condemned to death. He's saying goodbye to his family. He's been unjustly imprisoned for no fault of his own by the person who he gave his whole life to serve politically, Henry VIII. So it's a really despairing conclusion. And then the book he writes is I'll let you read about it in our book, but we discussed in the last couple chapters. And Moore writes this work which confronts the problem of political despair and the problem of anxiety and of nostalgia and at the kind of political compromises that can be made. And Moore is speaking to his Christian brothers and sisters. He sees like the Christians are making political compromises out of fear, anxiety, and despair. And he does this very astute kind of psychological analysis of how to keep hope alive in those situations of negativity, of not just crime or war, but even worse things that he imagines in that book. And we thought that was also, just as trenchant of something to sit with and think with in our time, when that's one of our great temptations is to accept a short-term compromise. On the one hand, not just a kind of materialist consolation of abundance on that side, but also the various compromises that can be made just for short-term comfort in a situation of kind of, great anxiety about our future together. So that's another whole side of Moore. It's not all, I wish we could have used that phrase, like it's not all chocolate rivers, for Moore, but, he ended with his martyrdom. So one of the mottos that we develop in the book is no martyrdom, no utopia, just as a summation of Moore's own life. I mean, those two hang together, at least in his example, about what kind of sacrifices are we ready to make on behalf of our neighbors, in the service of that kind of vision. What sort of bathrooms will we need to clean, in the service of a utopian vision? What sort of, as Dorothy Day said in a passage Jason shared with me, those who we serve in the soup kitchens do not always smell good. And we have to, that's like the first great temptation that she wrestles with all of her volunteers showing up at the Catholic worker houses, is actually loving the people they serve with. So martyrdom's small and large, but that's sort of the flip side of Moore's own example.
Taylor, do you want to
Yeah,
take your
maybe
next question?
I'll take a question, but if I just before I do we have any more questions from the audience before I dive into this one? Which I think
Can I make a small comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. It's related to the idea that you have to have a story or you create your own stories. And then you look at somebody else's stories and then try to mimic them, or if they inspire you and give you hope. There is a person or like I guess a group or a nonprofit that does that for nonviolence. They find non episodes of nonviolence in the world and then they put it on a website, and
Hmm.
it's supposed to inspire people to also do nonviolent actions. I think that's really kind of in line with what you were talking about.
It's a beautiful example. Thank you.
Alrighty. I'm gonna ask this question, which is okay. Like, kind of think about how to frame this, but one thing, like a good friend of mine who sort of really works in this space as well, has a phrase that she uses, which is that success is succession, which is basically that when you're doing world building, like it needs to persist and endure and kind of for this world to really have meaning. Like, and I think that there's elements of this which we've kind of touched on, right? Even speaking about, kind of passing on an imaginative utopian vision to the next generation or things like that. But this question of like, is the utopia that you've built sustainable? Um, and one thing that kind of comes up for me in thinking about these things from my kind of complex systems background is how tricky it is to actually kind of build something that will sustain. Um, Especially because I think a lot of times you see in utopian visions this desire for self-sustainability. And I wonder whether you would point this to being um, maybe an example of a closure that more would find uncomfortable. But one of the examples you use in the book um, of one of the failures, actually, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was a small utopian project in the desert that kind of lasted for a little while and failed. Throw in quickly what it
Outside
was
Los
called.
Angeles, Llano del Rio, I think it was called.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. That one. And that one sort of seemed to have this vision of like, well, we'll just self-sustain in our little, compound in the desert and we won't need anybody else. Um, and the thing that popped into my mind was this project that happened in the 90s called Biosphere 2, which the vision behind the project was to sort of essentially create a little bubble that was Earth's biosphere to potentially like think about if we were going to go into space, like how would that go? What would we need? And so they created this essentially this big glass dome and they put trees in there and animals in there and humans and tried to kind of recreate this whole little biosphere. And the idea was that the humans would like live inside there for a couple of years and see how it went. And it failed epically and like everything that could go wrong did go wrong, essentially. Um, the biggest issue was the oxygen levels inside collapsed. And one of the big reasons was because the soil bacteria were like using more oxygen than they had, budgeted for. And if they'd used a less rich soil, it like wouldn't have, that might not have happened. Um, they had issues with like pollinators because the glass that they were using for the dome was impacting the UV light, which the bees used to like identify which flowers were the right flowers. Um, all of these different problems. Um, the trees got weak because there was no wind, um, which I think is an interesting point, just as like a little side piece of like the necessity of some amount of adversity to develop resilience, and kind of whether a utopia puts itself at unnecessary risk by kind of trying to minimize all adversity. Um, but there's sort of this question of like creating self-sustainability is really, really, really hard. Um, Especially if, you have a vision of a utopia that is quite uniform, where say like everybody follows a similar schedule and every like a utopia of the commons, right? Where everything's in common, kind of you say, okay, well, does that actually form a healthy ecosystem that's able to sustain? So that's kind of my question from the complex system side of things is, sometimes like, do we actually need that variation, right? We know healthy ecosystems, for example, require apex predators. If we if the apex predators go extinct, the food web beneath them can collapse as well, even though you might say, oh, well, surely the predators are a bad thing, but actually not, right? So, you know, our intuitions about what might be good or what might be bad in a utopia are not necessarily always going to like play out that way.
Yeah, I've got something here, which is so um, I like that description of the wind stopping and sustainability and so on. Now, in some ways, Moore doesn't accept the distinction between the like pocket utopia over here and then the non-utopia, which is the entire system or structure over there, because he thinks they're both
Mm,
cosmopoetic world play. And so systems problems are going to happen within any world making project. So,
right.
for instance, the fires we're having, this mega fires, the smoke, so in a way, we are in a biodome right now that our world making is destroying and is no longer sustainable, right? So,
Right.
I think one thing to say from the utopian humanist tradition is just that that's an issue for any form of cosmopoetic world play. And this tradition doesn't expect that to go away, just like it doesn't expect moral evil to go away, and it doesn't expect natural evils to go away either. Um, Now, one thing we really tried to pull from more and radicalize was the idea that utopia multiplies and doesn't subtract. So, again, you could contrast this with Marxism if you wanted to, get kind of fighting words philosophically with other traditions. But Marxism and has a single structure regime that is replaced with the demise of liberal
Mm,
capitalist order, whereas that's not Moore's model at all. Moore's model is utopia multiplies itself through different cities. And in fact, while you were speaking, I looked up, there's chapter 9 on unreal cities. We draw on this theorist of urban life and ecology named Murray Bookchin. He was an American political philosopher, and he says that small scale cities are actually ecological cities, but that they're going to have to respond to localism. So, for instance, sustainable energy sources might happen in different ways in grasslands, forests, jungles, et cetera. Like there's this case of Iceland where they use thermal heat. So we're in favor of like a multiplication of system forms with the end, and we're quite, I think, strategically ready to pick up or drop any of them because we don't have this blueprint conception of the good society. What we won't drop is the humanistic commitment. But
mm,
I would say, if anything, our system has a homogeneity biosphere problem right now, where we try to reproduce the exact same energy system absolutely everywhere. Like air conditioning in Qatar, and like everything is the same. And in fact, we're getting blowback from that because the world making is interfacing with the earth in ways that are destructive. And so we actually think that the small R Republican tradition that sees the city and the neighborhood as the first step scale at which you then scale up to replacing the state and the market has something for ecological sustainability. I mean, it's often remarked, it's almost become a cliche that the medieval city is ecologically sustainable. They didn't know it was. They were just trying to make it a human scale, or they didn't have the industry to make it bigger than that. But we're in favor of returning without being Luddites within the current technological conditions to the sensitivity of world making at the city level that wouldn't fall prey. We would still have system failures. It's just that it wouldn't be like we're all locked in the biodome and we're all sucking smoke now because we didn't get the system right and there's only one system.
right. I think that is like a really, it's a very ecological way to think of it, of like different, almost different cities as different niches that kind of each have their own micro environments essentially that, you can build that local utopia. But I think the mistake then is to think of it as like enclosed bubbles where each one is self-sustaining rather than thinking, like we actually want a world where you have exchange of ideas, you have potentially trade and exchange of goods and free movement between those as well.
Right. And in no way are we, so we're not committed to the idea that you don't have globalism, but it's a globalism of the cities, of the local. So it turns things around basically. Whereas right now everything gets nationalized or globalized. We have the
Mhm.
opposite view that it should start from sensitivity to locality. But it's not about, so like I said, we're not committed at all to the idea that, you have like a schedule that's strictly policed, or I don't know if you want to get into this, Dave, but in a way, I think um, what's getting mixed up here is sort of a collectivist view of utopia that was taken up by 20th century communism with what we're advocating, which is very, very different. And it's very hostile to homogeneity of system. But I would
Mhm.
throw back at, the reigning order that it has your biodome problem and homogeneity.
Yeah.
And we think, a proposal out of that, which is
Mm. Interesting.
humanistic experimentation from the bottom up. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that makes sense. David, do you have anything to add?
When I think of the biodome, I'm thinking of it as a kind of metaphor. It's a recent
Yes, I meant it as
invention.
a metaphor,
Yeah, you meant it as a
not
metaphor,
necessarily.
but it's sort of it's an invented ecosystem that uh, begins with a very short memory and then tries to reproduce all the kind of objects that are found around it. I, I I think, it's not so much about Christianity versus other religions, but I do think that More's understanding of the way that humans dwell in the world cosmopoetically does work well with religions, regardless of what religion it is. But religions are sort of very long-term, durable, sustainable, ecological systems, so to speak, not in the natural world, but in terms of the human world and the world of the imagination, that provide a place for the formation of human individuals and groups and kind of coordinates them with the imagination at the largest scale in time and space and beyond individual lifetimes. And I think that's something that Moore is maybe drawing on that we could easily take for granted or kind of miss because it looks like a particular private preference of his from our perspective, like an elective that he chose instead of something necessary. But I wonder how much that they're relying on his particular religious tradition, and you could imagine others, but relying on his particular religious tradition as a kind of ecosystem, as a kind of organic biosphere, so to speak, metaphorically, is part of the power that the imagination is able to have on that basis and on the foundation of that kind of ecosystem. It's like a place to breathe. It's like a place for a kind of porosity of exchange with the natural environment that's not in terms of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, but in terms of imagination and change and practice and friendship and dwelling together with other human beings.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to think of it as almost like the historical thread that prevents your utopia from being a full blank slate thinking,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah, we're very hostile to that's a helpful way to put it because we basically view utopia as a tradition that we're participating in. And then we try to
Mm,
throw up like exemplars of the tradition and carry it further. But we don't think that it's utopia is not tabula rasa, like engineering of the human. It inherit. So the problem here is utopia is multiplied as a term and is used in so many ways. And so we use
mm,
it as both a social reality claim, cosmopoesis, and as a thick ethical claim, the place worthy of the human to finally dwell. But those are narrower than just like build whatever you want or imagine whatever you want. It's not unconstrained ethically or anthropologically for us or traditionally for us, right?
You had me get my
Yeah,
copy. Oh, go ahead, David.
yeah, I'm hearing sort of a sense in which utopia needs to be sort of a moral ecosystem. Um,
Definitely.
That's well said.
and so there has to be, and I guess the challenge is, if there's conflict, you need both a means of resolving it, um, which depends both on structures and on individual attitudes, and also perhaps a way of capturing whatever was learned by from that resolution and incorporating it into the future. And when I think of a biological ecosystem, there are sort of constraints that um, keep things within the bounds of biology. And that aspect may not exist in a moral universe. I mean, there, how do you sort of, except through mutual agreement, stay within some set of ethical bounds when conflicts arise?
Right. And
Biology, it happens on its own.
I think
That may be more troublesome morally.
one of the reasons utopia has such a bad name is because post 20th century, what everyone sees in there is totalitarian collectivism that's sort of, you could make a cost benefit analysis on whatever means are necessary to achieve utopia, right? And obviously the tradition we're speaking from ethically is very hostile to that. If I can just get one word in here that is in the book is that one thing I think has been lost from ancient philosophy is the distinction between the ideal regime and the attainable regime. And we talk about that for a short portion in the book, but real utopia. So take like a real concrete case. Let's just take MLK as like our pedagogy for post-racial belonging. He made friendships across racial groups, and even though he grew up in a strict apartheid world. And so we say in the book that utopia had already, post-racialism had already arrived in the circle of his friendships. And that became an icon of change, of ethical change and pedagogy for millions of people. Unfortunately, it's in retreat right now. It's not gone, but it's in retreat. So one thing that even the micro utopia can do that shouldn't be understated is that it can be a pedagogy that improves and reforms and makes more humane even bad regimes or bad places. And I think it's not an all or nothing. In some utopian traditions like those of Marxism, it's like we either have the revolution or it's totally illegitimate. And that's not our view. Our view is you could have a more humanizing set of energies or forces, still having the horizon of totality like Marxism, of something better, but that can do something now. And it is concretely better. And so we're interested in the ways that that can happen now, even if it's just a gamble or putting your cards on the table that you hope for a more human society. It may or may not arrive. But what can arrive right now are more human associations that might have a redounding effect. I'm very against this idea that MLK or Dorothy Day, they were just dreamers who didn't understand political realism. No, they changed the real. They changed the racial real. And we are starved of that kind of witness. That's why we're in such a bad, vicious way, everybody, because we don't have any kind of like witnesses to a different way of being together. We don't have utopia in Dave and my sense of the term. Like it's gone. It's not on the radar. Dystopia is everywhere. Utopia, you can't find it.
Unless there's one
And
exception.
and go ahead.
I was going to say there's one exception where you are allowed to dream of utopias as long as it's not on planet Earth and it's on Mars, you know? So in other words, like then you can go crazy and you can say we're going to be transhumanists and everything. So the science fiction as a kind of function, which comes out of more, but it's the, and I use this word with some caution, but it's the secular version that kind of corrals and channels utopian dreaming into the future. So in the book, we talk about science fiction as one narrower version of utopian dreaming that goes into the future, but into an unreal future, which is not a religious future or a future of a heaven, but it's a future that is, in a different planet, in a time far, far away, in a different galaxy. Or it's a dreaming that gets channeled into the past. That's a kind of damaging reverse dreaming that's nostalgia, which is a dreaming of a fantasy of the past, which sort of turns away from a future out of despair and a loss of hope, and dreams in reverse, which is even worse. So those are your sort of options right now. Science fiction dreaming into a fantastical future, a realism which says no dreaming is permitted, or a reverse dreaming into nostalgia in the past. And we're trying to offer this fourth alternative, which is dreaming without limits. Because the limits, we sort of advise in the book, whenever you see despair and nostalgia, you also see that realism of an enforced limit on a social dream. And the best dreamers, like the ones Jason cited that we discuss and more, suspend all the limits. And that takes them into the realm of a religious imagination, not for the sake of the religion, so to speak, per se, but for the sake of suspending any limits on dreaming or on hope as a sort of resolute principle.
I don't think it's an accident that Elon Musk thinks chess is a solved game. which is both mathematically wrong, but I think there's something significant about that narrowing of imagination and, calling a solved, to your point, Jason, calling a game that's not solved a solved game is tied to that kind of colonization of the imagination.
Yeah, it's completely solved. We just need to get it to Mars and it'll be done, right? I mean, so, and those are those utopias of abundance that are critical. But I see Derek has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I had one thing I think when I put my hand up, which was I was going and then I think have a second one on that regarding that tangent about science fiction. First of all, talking about the sort of with the biodome example and sort of the rigidness of structures and whether or not like utopia is totalizing, it sounds to me, I just kind of want to throw a word out there that it sounds to me like what you're advocating against is a sort of anti-high modernist vision of utopia that like as opposed to the sort of like scientifically planned forest or a version of the biodome that flattens a sort of social or environmental matrix into this rigid schema that then makes it fragile. Your alternative is this more organic or humanist. I just wanted to throw out like anti-high modernist as like that. That's what was coming up for me when you were talking about that. And then it's
That's very
interesting.
perceptive. But like Francis Bacon is like a bad guy in the book, even though he is a Maurian, but he's the first science fiction utopian, New Atlantis, where science will solve our moral and ethical problems. He's like the forefather to Elon Musk and tech utopia. And that was very well put, Derek, that we are against this idea that controllability and technological control can replace ethical and spiritual transformation. That you could have a good society if you just got the technology right and you technologized the hell out of the environment and whatever else was around you, and then boom, like utopia achieved. Sorry, Derek. Go.
Yeah, well, so that actually leads well into my second point then, which is that like I'm a big science fiction person, admittedly, and so again, I haven't read the what you've written about this, but I think there are something I have been thinking about is like there is like I think a dual strain of like science fiction utopianism. I don't think it's all one thing. There is absolutely, I mean, like incontestably, there is the sort of Elon Musk, do not create the torture nexus, like flavor of techno utopianism. That's just like, no, but I will create the torture nexus. That's happening. That's not, can't be contradicted. But I do still think that like science fiction is some of likewise the most fertile ground, in my experience, for utopian thinking. I mean, like works like The Dispossessed or Red Mars, which do end up being works that consider the political, the humanist, the spiritual elements of that evolution. I mean, like they are set in the future or set in on another planet, but they do anyway. I just wanted to like maybe you can't like encompass that in the writing, but I just wanted to like I think push. I'm not sure if I agree with you there. Is I guess my point.
Mhm. Yeah, fair point. We had some conversations this summer about Kim Stanley Robinson and Ministry of the Future. You mentioned Red Mars. I mean, that's another. You're absolutely right. I have to say that it's a complex and diverse genre with lots of different pathways. Um, I think we're coming at it from Frederick Jameson's turn towards science fiction in his own imaginings of what a revolutionary post-capitalist utopia might look like. Um, and at the same time, he pushes off against other genres of fiction and certainly off against the religious imagination. But I take your point. I think the criteria would have to be is the imagination of different times and spaces in that literature engaging the full complexity of the human, or is it sort of using it as a substitute, is using that scientific imagination as a substitute for moral transformation?
Yeah.
But there can be lots of ways to be more complicated and interesting about that, as you point out.
Yeah, and I agree with David, and also really they're wonderful sci-fi. I love the sci-fi genre but as dystopian oftentimes, honestly, like Blade Runner or Children of Men. But I think so. One thing, just picking up on what David just said there, we often ask ourselves, what's the technological curve? Everyone asks themselves that. AI, this, that, the other. I wish we would change the question to what is the spiritual and moral curve of human development? Who is the most morally, spiritually developed person on planet Earth right now? No one asks that question, almost no one. And we're suffering for it. I mean, there are times when people have been more aware of that. It's Mahatma Gandhi, it's Nelson Mandela, but there isn't that sense of people are so sort of so we overreacted to the sci-fi genre because I completely take your point, Derek, that the sci-fi genre itself is so multitudinous and so creative and really fascinating. So it's not so much anti-sci-fi, it's anti this idea that the technological curve will either save us or damn us. Like our tools are our tools are our tools. Who's using them? I'm not against tools. Like I'm not against science. Good. Science good. But then science doesn't make us good. It just sort of enhances our abilities. So I wish we'd gotten this in, but like, what's the spiritual curve? What's the moral curve? Not just what's the technological curve. That's the utopian humanist question is who's on the outer edge of the spiritual curve, you know, or of the moral curve, the humanistic curve.
Jason, if you were to point to someone, like to point to anybody on Earth who you think is on the edge, like who are the people that you would say
Dorothy
are?
Day, Greg Boyle, these people that we call like the exemplary utopians or dreamers. I mean, like if you
But like today, like alive today and acting
yeah,
together.
Greg Boyle is
Greg
alive and
Boyle.
Yes, he is. He is.
but not just
He's
Greg
just
Boyle, but also
okay.
the Greg Boyle's like a stand-in for like the network of homies around. And we kind of, same
Right.
with Dorothy Day or, and something we talk about in the book is there are a lot of unknown or unspoken. But the reason they're unknown is we don't lavish social praise on people who are developed in this way. They're all over the place. They're anonymous. I'm convinced the world would fall apart and fly apart if there weren't actually the humanist next door or the person who looks past ideology, looks past this and the other thing to actually treat you as another human and have a little bit of patience or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like exemplars, I would say, um, Greg Boyle, Dorothy Day didn't die that long ago. She is a personal hero of ours. Um, but yeah, and others, but they're kind of stand-ins for that kind of a work. But I mean, it's a totally fair question because for us, it's utopia is just pie in the sky if you don't actually have people who already live the new way, basically. We're not interested in just like fluffy dreaming over here. That's not helpful. It's just like it's sedation. It's like taking a drug practically. So, I mean, it's a totally fair question. It's just that we need to look more intensely for those figures and cultivate and want to be those figures, really.
Mm.
You made me get my old copy of Utopia with my highlighting from undergrad. There is a section to Dave's point on religion, that the religion of the utopians and the to your point, Jason, just the humor of that they all hold different beliefs, but they agree in one supreme power whom they call in their native language Mithra, which is such a just a funny like poke to use a Roman mystery god as the utopians
Mm.
kind of general supreme power, even though they all have different religious beliefs. So
Although it
um,
also sounds like an AI startup name today.
yeah, but I
Mithra.
mean, he's got that humor of like poking people
Yes.
who think of pagan, supersessionism of the pagan, and he's just like, no, we're gonna we're gonna it's messier. Um,
He even has some jokes about someone who was very hasty who wanted to be the bishop of the Utopians, but then later found out it didn't exist or something along those lines. So
right.
there's lots of poking fun back against his own religious tradition.
Yeah.
And, for people who don't know that, as Thomas said, that in the book, the religion of the Utopians is not a Christian religion. It's very clear.
Yeah.
Did you say Mithra? Is that what you said? That's the
Yeah. Yeah.
Greek god of, what was the Greek god of?
Well, I mean, it was kind of it was a Roman Mithraism, and the Roman Empire kind of took off, and that there's some parallels with Christianity, but it had Persian influences, Greek
Yeah.
influences, so it's itself this kind of symbol of a mishmash where this idea of um, where do you separate how do you pinpoint where the purity is? It's very difficult. So he's yeah, it's another reason to revisit with the two of yours book, as a companion, the text, because it's really rich.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked is because in my parents' native language, that word meet is they say it mitra, or I
Uh-huh.
can't say it properly, but it means friend.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah.
ask more about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dave's got a bunch of ancient languages on him. I don't. I'm completely trapped in the
I don't
modern.
think I know that language, but yeah, it's a Near Eastern Persian mystery cult that was around the figure of a youthful warrior god who was killed and resurrected, and you would eat a meal in his honor. So early Christians saw parallels to their own religion, like in the first and second centuries.
And I feel convicted by what Taylor said, because another example in the book is Matt Harper and the ongoing work of the LA Catholic Worker House. So I had a student of mine, Adian, who did this wonderful ethnography that we quote, and he's off to grad school at Berkeley, but um, as his undergrad, he was an undergraduate student of mine, and he just went and sort of observed the workings of the hospitality house that's in downtown LA, right off Skid Row. And so these aren't names that like make the newspapers, but I think
Yeah.
we mentioned one or two of them, but they're people who are sort of, yeah, engaged in this kind of a work. So,
Hmm.
I'd want to pass along Amy's question from the chat on humanists, altruists.
Suppose it depends what we mean by altruism. If it's selfless action done for its own sake, is that what we mean?
Yeah, I think so. But I have this feeling like you've kind of mentioned you have to give of yourself to martyr yourself to create this new world. And I think that like losing yourself into a new being totally exhausted and of yourself and then creating a new world doesn't sound appealing to a lot of people. So I think do humanists have to be altruistic or can they just be kind of more like enlightened or like
Hmm.
like is there I wonder if that makes sense. I'm just going to help.
Yeah. Can I share an example just from my morning today? This is like a live example that I've been thinking about today. I was talking with, I was in a conversation this morning with a group, and there was a Catholic deacon there. So he's in LA. He was describing how a couple years ago, and I've known him for a couple years, I didn't know this about his life. He's in his early 60s. And about 10, 15 years ago, he was working on Skid Row in LA, and he met a Rwandan refugee who was blinded in one eye and lost a leg, and then all of his family in the ethnic violence, and ended up, through a series of accidents, being without a home and living on the street. And this person, Kevin, learned from a friend that this gentleman was there, and he came and he spoke with him, and he just said, "Why don't you come and live in my house with me and my sons?" So he moved in and he stayed with him for 3 years, and they started calling each other, Dad and Yosam, I think was his name. And he was sort of reflecting on the meaning that this stranger became a son and he became his father. And so, in the face of that action, is that altruism? I guess. But I would want to add to that um, both sides of the utopian part. So, on the one side, he had to have the imagination that a totally different way of living life. Like, I don't do that when I walk down the street, invite someone. And he had children at home, by the way. It wasn't like he's living by himself. He had like older teenage sons with him at home. His wife had passed away. So I don't live like that. That required a kind of dreaming to even countenance that practice that then he engaged in. It immediately set up a new relationship of radical friendship, or what Father, Greg Boyle calls kinship, which is like a new way of social belonging, of responsibility for the neighbor that's very strange and radical and rare. But it also, as you can imagine, and he emphasized, the moment when this young man called him father or dad, it wasn't sort of like a kind of sappy sentimental moment of like, oh, he called me father. It actually was kind of terrifying because it meant a great exposure to responsibility for this other person's life that was now an obligation placed upon him. And Kevin had to expose himself to a tremendous amount of risk with this new unsought for, responsibility. So both sides of that. I mean, I think that's what we mean by martyrdom, just to use that example. It's not necessarily like an emptying of the self or an exhaustion of the self or a giving away of the self, but it's at least a kind of virtue of a courage to face a future without being overwhelmed by fear, hesitation, doubt. That's not going to be realistic. Where is he going to live? Who are we going to, how's he going to eat, et cetera, et cetera. But just sort of um, making a real utopia immediately present, like a virtuoso dreamer. So we try to use some of those examples. I wonder if the answer, to the question of like, where are they today and who do we admire today? So we can look at a couple prominent ones because they've left traces behind in literature or because they've gotten massive grants from the Gates Foundation, well deserved, Greg Boyle, Homo Industries. But 99.99% of the cases that we should be looking at are by definition anonymous and unknown, and just these sort of micro actions. But when we study the way that they act, we see that what they're doing is this sort of cosmopoietic dreaming where they dream a world into existence that they want to live into. And it requires some sort of, certainly freedom from nostalgia, but also a kind of courage in the face of possible suffering or possible loss or possible damage that maybe we can call martyrdom, that at least some more put those two things together. That's what we're trying to expose.
Hmm.
I'm going to put in the chat the stories of nonviolence that this brave person gathered. And so if anyone's interested in that, I'll put that in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have one quick observation, and then maybe Thomas, you can close us out. Um, I think there's something interesting. There's an interesting parallel between the idea of martyrdom and kind of taking on that kind of personal risk of believing in utopia and standing for utopia, and the kind of like I think that there's a parallel between that and the kind of risk that it takes in the sort of science world to attempt to create like the impossible in terms of technologies and to put one's sort of whole dedicate one's life and career to you know creating something for the good of humanity that from the outset doesn't necessarily seem possible. I think one of the things that was animating for me in wanting to host the salon was just absolute awe in the progress that we've made in curing diseases that were previously fatal over the past decades, looking at things like autonomous vehicles that are, now showing evidence that they reduce the number of road deaths and like fatal road accidents by like 90%. Right. And, I think back like when I was a child, if you had said, oh, we're going to have cars on the road that can, drive themselves, like I would have been like, oh, well, that's impossible. That's never going to happen. And I think that there's something similar about, I mean, this is not necessarily the moral piece, but there's a parallel to that, like willing to kind of stake your life, which, the time that you have on earth is your life, right? To dedicate that to kind of pursuing an impossible dream, I think, for the good of humanity is, I don't know, they feel I look at the people who dedicate themselves to those kinds of projects with the same kind of awe as someone who goes about who's would potentially like put their life on the line for a moral vision. I don't know if that is provocative or if you would disagree.
Yeah, that's so I was thinking about kind of on the other end of, what is it, Shelley, that talks about the unacknowledged legislators of the world as poets. But I think to Dave's point that there's the unacknowledged actions are probably the site of a lot of this poesis. But one thing that the book helped me think about, and that I now have to reread the whole book in light of, is W.G. Sebald's novel Austerlitz, that begins with the meeting of a stranger in Antwerp, who imparts information, just like More's Utopia. And I can't help but think there's something going on there of looking at colonialism, but kind of riffing off of that. And I think what you all have shown in your book and in this discussion with your gracious giving of time is how poetic and creative the utopian energy is. It does it. It's got many critical things to ask of it, but there's a sense of possibility of what type of thing can be utopian that I can already get from your book and start to affect the way that looking at texts again, even those that seem like Sebald, quite dark and quite haunting, that there's still that Morean energy in there to find. So just very, very grateful for your efforts.
Thank you. That's very kind of you guys. Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. This has been great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks for everybody that came. Appreciate all the questions. And yeah, look forward to more people getting the book in their hands and
Yeah.
spreading the word.
Yeah,
It's available
thank you.
now.
Yes.
Thanks.
Amazing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.